The wine glass shattered before I even registered that she had thrown it. And for one suspended second, the only sound in my mother-in-law's dining room was this hiss of red wine soaking into her white tablecloth, right next to my hand. "You ungrateful little gold digger," Veronica said, and her voice didn't shake at all, which was somehow worse than if she'd been screaming. "Get out of my house!" 40 people were watching. I could feel them watching the way you feel a sunburn starting before it actually hurts. That prickling awareness spreading across the back of my neck. My father-in-law's retirement party 3 days before Christmas, and I was standing there with wine dripping off my fingers onto a Aritzia dress I'd bought on sale because I was still paying off my student loans like a normal person, while Veronica Pemberton stood across the table in her pearls, breathing like she'd just won something. That was the night I finally called my mother. Not because I needed rescuing, because I needed a witness who loved me enough to remember every word, but to understand how a 61-year-old woman ended up hurling a glass of Beaujolais at her son's wife in front of half of Oakville's old money crowd. You have to go back 4 years to a Tuesday in October when my biggest problem was whether the client wanted matte or satin finish on a kitchen backsplash, and I still believed that being good at my job and good to people was enough to make a family love you. My name is Eleanor Voss. I'm 31 years old, and I'm an interior designer. Not the Pinterest board kind. The kind who gets called in when a heritage home in the annex needs to be rebuilt from the studs out while keeping its 1920s bones intact. I built my business from a one-bedroom apartment and a laptop, and by the time I met Marcus Pemberton, I had 4 employees and a wait list 3 months long. I tell you this not to brag, but because it matters later. Because the central insult of my life with the Pemberton family was that none of that ever counted for anything in Veronica's eyes. I met Marcus at a charity gala for the Hospital for Sick Children, which is a very Toronto sentence, I know. He was 40, a partner at a commercial law firm downtown, recently divorced. No kids, thank God, that simplified things. And he had this quiet, watchful way about him, like he was used to being the smartest person in a room and had learned not to advertise it. We didn't really click that night. We clicked 3 weeks later, at a coffee shop on Queen West, when he made fun of my order. A flat white with oat milk. "Of course," he said, like I was a type. And I made fun of his suit. And somewhere in there we ended up talking for 2 hours about nothing important and everything important at the same time. We dated for almost a year before he told his mother about me. I should have clocked that. I didn't. I told myself he was a private person, that he compartmentalized, that some men just don't loop their families into things until they're sure. What I didn't understand yet was that Veronica Pemberton wasn't a family member Marcus was protecting from disappointment. She was a force he'd spent his whole life managing, the way you manage weather. The first time I met her was at the house in Oakville, a stone and glass monument to Old Bay Street money that backed onto the lake. She opened the door herself. No housekeeper that day, which I'd later realize was a calculated choice. A small performance of down-to-earthness, and she looked me up and down in under 2 seconds, the way you'd assess a used car you already knew you weren't buying. "So you're the one," she said. Not hello, not nice to meet you. "So you're the one." I laughed, because I genuinely thought it was a joke. It wasn't. Dinner that night was 3 hours of Veronica asking questions that sounded like interest and functioned like an audit. Where did I go to school? Ryerson, now Toronto Metropolitan. And I watched something flicker behind her eyes, some private recalibration. Where were my parents from? My dad's family came over from Poland in the 70s, settled in Mississauga. My mom grew up in Sudbury, and Veronica said, "How interesting," in a tone that made it clear she did not find it interesting at all. What did my father do for a living? He'd been a high school shop teacher for 31 years before he retired. And at that one, Veronica actually set down her fork. "A shop teacher," she repeated, like she was confirming a diagnosis. Marcus reached under the table and squeezed my knee. I thought it was reassurance. Looking back, I think it was an apology he didn't have the spine to say out loud. Here's the thing about Veronica Pemberton that took me almost 2 years to fully understand. She didn't hate me because of anything I did. She hated me because of the math, her late husband's family. Marcus's father, Jeffrey, who died of a heart attack when Marcus was 26, had built a development company that put up half the office towers in the financial district in the 80s and 90s. Veronica had spent 4 decades curating an image of the Pemberton name as something rarefied, something that belonged in certain rooms and certain postal codes and certain marriages. And I was a designer from Mississauga whose dad fixed engines for a living before he taught other kids to fix engines. In Veronica's ledger, I was a debit, not a credit. It didn't matter that I owned my business outright, debt-free except the loans from school. It didn't matter that I made more in a good year than most people in my family tree combined. To Veronica, money you made was always going to be lesser than money you were born into. I was new money pretending I belonged near old money, and she was never, ever going to let me forget it. For a long time, she did it quietly. She'd forget to mention fast events until the last minute, then act wounded when I couldn't rearrange my whole life around a Tuesday lunch she told me about on Monday night. She'd compliment my outfits in a way that was actually a critique. "Isn't that brave, wearing that to a luncheon?" Brave being the word Veronic used for anything she found embarrassingly middle class. She'd ask Marcus, in front of me, whether he'd thought about settling down with someone more established, as though I were a placeholder he hadn't gotten around to swapping out yet. Marcus's response to all of this was the same every single time. A tight smile, a quiet, "Mom, come on," and then nothing. No boundary, no consequence. Just a vague hope, communicated entirely through body language, that if everyone just stayed calm, the moment would pass and we could all pretend it hadn't happened. I want to be honest with you. I loved Marcus. I loved the way he listened. Actually listened, when I talked about clients and projects. I loved that he cried at his father's grave every single year on the anniversary and never once tried to hide it from me. He was a genuinely good man in almost every measurable way. But he had one significant flaw, and it was this. He had spent his entire life being managed by his mother, and somewhere very deep down, some boy-shaped part of him still believed that disagreeing with her openly would cause some irreversible catastrophe. So he let things slide. Again and again, he let things slide, and every slide chipped a little more off whatever foundation we were supposedly building. We got engaged on a Saturday in late September, at the cottage Marcus's family owned on Lake Joseph. Just the two of us, no audience, which in hindsight I think was deliberate on his part. A small, private rebellion. The one place Veronica's gravity didn't reach. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. We drove back to the city that Sunday, so happy I thought my chest might actually crack open from it. Veronica found out from a photo Marcus's cousin posted online before he'd even called her himself, and the first conversation I ever had with her as his fiancé was her calling my cell. Not Marcus's, mine. To ask, without so much as a congratulations. "And what exactly are your thoughts on a prenuptial agreement?" I told her that was a conversation for Marcus and me to have together, which was true, and also the politest possible way of telling her it was none of her business. She didn't like that. Veronica did not handle, in general, being told no by anyone, but especially not by me. The engagement party was her idea, not mine. I would have been happy with dinner at a restaurant, honestly. But Veronica insisted on hosting at the Oakville house. "It's tradition," she said, though it was tradition for exactly no one I'd ever met, and from the planning stage forward, every single decision became a battlefield disguised as etiquette. The flowers I picked were a little casual for an event like this. The band I suggested was fine, I suppose, if we want people dancing to that sort of thing. When I mentioned, gently, that my parents would obviously be attending, Veronica paused for a beat too long before saying, "Of course," naturally, in a tone that made it sound like the opposite of natural. That detail matters, so hold on to it. My parents, Walter and Diane Voss, were absolutely going to be at that engagement party. They had been invited from the very beginning. What changed, what Veronica orchestrated with a precision that I genuinely didn't understand till much later, was the seating, the timing, and a miscommunication about an earlier start time that conveniently never reached my parents' inbox. My mother and father arrived 40 minutes after the party had technically already started, walking into a room where everyone else had already had 2 drinks and formed their first impressions, where the receiving line had already dissolved, where Veronica had already had ample, uninterrupted time to work the room with her version of events about who exactly her son was marrying. I didn't know any of that yet, standing in my dress in front of the mirror that afternoon, genuinely excited, genuinely hopeful that maybe, this party would be the thing that finally softened something between Veronica and me. It was not that. The party itself started fine in the sense that nothing actively terrible happened in the first hour. I worked the room the way I'd learned to over 2 years of Pemberton family events. Warm, polished, asking people about themselves, deflecting any direct question about my background with a light joke before pivoting the conversation elsewhere. Marcus stayed close to me most of the night, which I appreciated, though I noticed Veronica kept finding small ways to pull him away. Introduce him to a business contact here, need his opinion on the caterer there. Little tugs on a leash she still believed she held. It was around the time the toasts started that things shifted. Marcus's uncle gave a sweet, slightly rambling speech about Marcus as a kid. A colleague from his firm made a joke about his billable hours that landed well. And then Veronica stood up, glass in hand, and the room quieted in that particular way, rooms quiet for matriarchs. "I just want to say," she began, smiling in a way that did not reach her eyes, "how proud I am of my son for finding someone who's taught him so much about, what's the phrase, humble beginnings." A small ripple of polite, uncertain laughter. "Eleanor's father was a shop teacher. Did you all know that? Wonderful, salt-of-the-earth people. It's good for Marcus, I think, to be reminded where the rest of the world lives." I felt my face go hot. Across the room, I saw my father's jaw tighten. He'd arrived by then, he and my mother seated near the back at a table Veronica had assigned them to, the table closest to the kitchen doors. I didn't say anything. I smiled, the way you're trained to smile when someone insults you in a room full of people who are all watching to see how you'll take it, because reacting visibly is somehow always framed as the real crime, worse than the insult itself. Marcus didn't say anything either. He laughed, a small, awkward laugh, the same laugh he always gave when his mother did this, the laugh that meant, "Please, everybody, let's not make this a thing." That was the moment, if I'm honest, when something in me went very quiet and very still. Not angry yet. Just done watching him not protect me. The actual incident happened about 40 minutes later, near the dessert table. Mostly because of something so small it's almost embarrassing to repeat. My mother had asked, kindly, whether there'd be a vegetarian option at the wedding, since my younger cousin doesn't eat meat, and Veronica, who'd had several glasses of wine by then, had said something cutting about how some people's families have such particular needs. And I had, finally, after 2 years of swallowing every single comment, said, quietly but clearly, "Veronica, that's enough." 2 words. That's all it took. She turned on me like I'd struck her first. "Excuse me?" I said, "That's enough," I repeated. "You've spent the whole night making comments about my family. I'm asking you to stop." The room had gone very quiet by then, the way rooms do right before something breaks. Veronica's face did something I'd never seen it do before. A kind of crumbling rage, all her polish falling away at once, like a mask slipping off mid-sentence. "You ungrateful little gold digger," she said. And that's when the glass left her hand. Whether she meant to throw it or just gestured too violently with it, I genuinely don't know to this day. And honestly, it doesn't matter. It hit the table, not me, shattering against a candlestick, wine spraying across the white cloth and across my hand and across the sleeve of my dress. "Get out of my house." 40 people stared. My father started to stand up from his seat by the kitchen doors, and I watched my mother put a hand on his arm. Not to stop him, I realized later, but to give me the first move, because she understood something I was only beginning to understand myself. That this was mine to handle. That the version of this story where my dad came charging across the room to defend me was the version where I stayed small forever. I looked at Marcus. "I want you to understand what that look was." It wasn't a plea. By that point, I already knew what I'd see. Marcus was standing very still, his face pale, his mouth slightly open, and he said, to his own mother, in front of everyone, "Mom, that's too far. That's too far. Not get out. Not apologize to my fiancé right now. Not even moving to my side. Just a soft, ineffectual sentence floating into a room that had already broken." I didn't cry. I want to be very clear about that because so many people, later, assumed I must have, assumed there were tears, assumed I ran out of the room. I didn't. I picked up a cloth napkin from the table, wiped the wine off my hand with a steadiness that surprised even me, and I said, to the room, in a voice that came out far calmer than I felt, "I think Veronica needs to sit down." Then I walked to where my parents were sitting, kissed my mother on the cheek, and said, "I need 10 minutes. Can you wait?" She nodded. My father had already pulled out his phone, not to call anyone, I'd learn later, but to start a voice recording. The instinct of a man who'd spent 31 years in a school system that taught him exactly how fast a story can get rewritten once witnesses start comparing memories with each other and forgetting details. I went out onto the back terrace, the one that overlooked the frozen edge of the lake, and I called my mother. Not from inside, from outside, where it was quiet and cold, and I could finally let my hands shake, the way they'd wanted to shake since the glass shattered. I want to clarify something, because I know how this might sound. Calling my mother when she was sitting 40 feet away inside the house. I wasn't calling for comfort, not exactly. I was calling because my mother is, among other things, a retired paralegal who spent 22 years working family and civil litigation files at a firm in Mississauga. And the very first thing she said to me, before "Are you okay?" before anything else, was, "Eleanor, listen to me. Don't apologize to anyone tonight. Don't say anything that sounds like an apology. Just breathe." That's the kind of mother I have, not the kind who tells you it'll all be fine. The kind who tells you exactly what to do and trusts you to do it. I stood on that terrace for maybe 5 minutes, the lake wind cutting through my dress, and when I went back inside, the party had fractured into little clusters of whispered conversation, the way parties do after something happens that everyone witnessed, but no one knows how to name out loud. Marcus found me near the coat closet, his face a wreck of guilt. "Eleanor, I am so sorry. I should have." "You should have a lot of things," I said. "We're not doing this here. We didn't do it there. We did it 3 days later in our condo, after I'd had time to think, after my mother had quietly, methodically, helped me understand something I hadn't let myself see clearly while I was still inside the relationship. That Marcus's silence that night wasn't an isolated failure. It was the pattern. It had always been the pattern. Every single time Veronica crossed a line, Marcus's instinct wasn't to protect me. It was to manage his mother, to soothe her, to find some middle path where nobody had to feel the full weight of what had happened. And a man who spends his whole engagement managing his mother's feelings around his fiancé is a man who, eventually, is going to manage his wife's feelings around his mother, too. I'd just gotten a 4-year preview of my entire marriage, condensed into one shattered wine glass. "I love you," I told him, sitting across from him at our kitchen table, the one I'd designed myself, ironically, with reclaimed oak and brass hardware I'd sourced from a salvage yard in Hamilton. "I do. But I need you to actually hear what I'm about to say, instead of finding a way to make it smaller. Your mother assaulted me. That's not dramatic. That's literally what it was, in a room full of people. And you said that's too far, like she'd told an off-color joke. That's not a partner. That's a referee who's been refereeing his mother's behavior his whole life and calling it love." He didn't argue. That was almost worse. I think some part of me wanted him to fight for it, to fight for us. And instead, he just sat there, nodding slowly, looking like a man finally hearing, out loud, something he'd known and avoided for 30 years. "What do you want me to do?" he finally asked. "I want you to have wanted to do something 3 days ago, without me having to ask," I said. "And since you didn't, I don't think there's a version of this where I trust you to do it for the next 40 years. We ended the engagement that week. I gave the ring back. A beautiful ring, genuinely, a deco-style emerald cut that had been his grandmother's, which, under different circumstances, I might have actually felt sentimental handing over, except that's 2 days after I returned it, I learned through a mutual friend that Veronica had immediately started telling people I'd stolen it and only given it back once confronted, which was such a complete fabrication that it actually helped me. In a strange way, it reminded me exactly what kind of woman I'd be free of. But here's the part of this story that I think people actually want to hear. The part where it stops being about heartbreak and starts being about consequences. Because my mother did not, in fact, let things end at, "Well, that's a shame, sweetheart. You're better off." About 6 weeks after the engagement ended, I got a call from my mother asking if I remembered the name of the photographer Veronica had hired for the party. I said yes. I'd actually recommended her, a woman named Priscilla I'd worked with on staging shoots before. My mother asked if I could get the full, uncropped photo set. I did because Priscilla, it turned out, had several photos from that exact moment. The broken glass mid-air, my face, Veronica's face contorted with rage, my father half risen from his chair. Along with, crucially, the audio recording my father had quietly started the moment the temperature in the room changed. It turned out that throwing a glass that strikes another person, even partially, and the doctor's note I got 2 days later confirmed a small cut on my hand from a glass shard, 4 stitches, nothing dramatic but documented, constitutes assault under Canadian law, and my mother, with her decades of paralegal experience and her network of former colleagues, walked me through exactly what my options were. I want to be honest. I wasn't initially interested in pursuing it legally. I'm not a vindictive person by nature, and some bruised, exhausted part of me just wanted to disappear quietly and rebuild. But my mother sat me down at her kitchen table in Mississauga, the same kitchen table I'd done my homework on as a kid, and said something I've thought about almost every day since. "Eleanor, this isn't about revenge. It's about the fact that women like Veronica only ever stop when stopping costs them something. If you walk away quietly, she gets to keep her story, the one where the gold digger ungratefully threw away a good thing. If you don't, the truth gets to exist somewhere official, on paper, with witnesses and stitches and a recording. That's not vindictive. That's just making sure the truth has a place to live." So I filed a police report. not out of fury. By then, the fury had mostly burned down into something colder and clearer. But because my mother was right, and because Priscilla, when contacted, turned out to be more than willing to provide her photos as a witness statement, having apparently found Veronica condescending and unpleasant during the entire booking process and feeling, in her words, no loyalty whatsoever to that woman. What I hadn't anticipated, and what made the next part genuinely satisfying in a way I'm not going to pretend I didn't enjoy, was how quickly Veronica's careful social architecture started to crumble once the formal complaint went through. Marcus, to his credit, and I'll give him this much, even now, did not try to talk me out of it, and when a detective eventually called him for a statement, he confirmed, accurately and without hedging, what he'd witnessed. I think some part of him needed to do that one decent thing, even 4 years too late. Veronica was charged with assault. It didn't go to trial. These things rarely do in cases like this. But she accepted a peace bond and a formal apology requirement as part of a resolution that kept it off her record long term, provided she had no further incidents, which I'm told was the absolute minimum consequence available and which she fought through a very expensive lawyer every single step of the way. The apology, when it finally came, arrived as a stiff, lawyer-drafted letter that used the phrase "any perceived distress" instead of the word "sorry" anywhere in its 3 paragraphs, which honestly made me laugh out loud when I read it, alone, in my apartment, 4 months after the worst night of my engagement. I heard, through the same mutual friend grapevine that had carried Veronica's lies about the ring, that the story in certain Oakville circles had shifted significantly by spring. That the woman who once described me as the one with such contempt was now occasionally referred to, behind cupped hands at luncheons, as poor Veronica after that whole business at the party, which I won't pretend doesn't carry a certain quiet satisfaction. Marcus and I didn't stay in touch, not really. He sent one message about 5 months after everything, just to say he was in therapy, actual therapy, working through what he called a lifetime of conflict avoidance, and that he hoped I knew none of it had been because he didn't love me. I believe that, actually. I think he did love me, in the limited way a person can love someone while still being fundamentally unwilling to risk his mother's disapproval to protect them. Love isn't actually the rare thing in most of these stories. The rare thing is choosing someone over the comfort of staying small. My business is doing better than ever, for what it's worth. I took on 2 more designers last spring, and I finally did the kitchen renovation in my own place that I'd been promising myself for 3 years, ironically using the same reclaimed oak supplier I'd sourced for the table where I told Marcus it was over. My mother still brings up that night sometimes, usually with a small, satisfied smile, usually around the part where she says, "The look on that woman's face when the officer showed up at her door." Veronica was served at home, apparently, on a Tuesday afternoon, with her garden club mid-meeting in the next room, which my mother considers, and I genuinely cannot disagree, one of the more elegant pieces of justice she's witnessed in her career. I think about that party sometimes, the shattered glass, the wine soaking into white linen, Veronica's voice telling me to get out of her own house like I was something she could simply remove. What she never understood, what people like her rarely do until it's far too late, is that humiliating someone publicly only works as a weapon if that person has nowhere else to stand. I had somewhere else to stand. I had a mother who picked up the phone without asking a single unnecessary question, a father who started recording before anyone told him to, and a life I'd built with my own 2 hands long before I ever met a single Pemberton. Veronica spent 40 years curating a name meant to make people feel small in its presence. In the end, all it took to bring it down was 1 glass of wine, 4 stitches, and a woman who finally stopped being polite about it.